think about the way that we depend on harvests. If we keep doing things the way that we're doing them, we won't be able to grow food on this planet for that much longer. Even in the food as medicine space, we don't often address enough the role that cooking plays in all of this. You can't talk about the Farm Bill without talking about Medicare and Medicaid and health policy and health spending in America. The topics are all connected, and we cannot avoid that. Welcome back to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. This is the first episode of Season 2, and we're going to continue on the journey that we started last year. I started the podcast focused on a couple critical topics. I talked about childhood obesity in my first episode. And I also talked about various names that I considered for the podcast based on the kinds of topics and themes that I wanted to cover. One of the names that I considered was No Skinny Experts, by which I mean I really want to speak with experts in fields where they have a personal connection, a personal buy-in, some skin in the game. So not skinny in the literal sense of the word, but skinny in terms of their own personal weight that the topic carries for them. So for me, for example, I have a lot of personal skin in the game when it comes to health, nutrition and health policy, food policy. These topics are personally meaningful for me. I have a lot of lived experience that informs the work that I do in them. And I really find that I get the most trust and faith and enjoyment from speaking with experts who have a similar personal tie-in. That's not to say that you can't be an expert in a field that doesn't really touch you personally, but I do think that when you have that personal lived experience that ties you to it, it's just a little bit different the way that you show up to that space. And so on this season, even though I don't call the podcast No Skinny Experts, we will continue to bring that energy and speak with people who have real personal lived experiences that tie them to the work that they do and that really make that work not just professionally meaningful, but personally meaningful, and that keep them on that path, always pushing forward, always striving to learn and do more because it means so much to them, to their families, to their own health, and to their own lived experiences, informed by their own personal lived experiences. So I didn't choose to call the podcast No Skinny Experts. I chose to call it the Marian Flaxman Network. And I want to talk a little bit about what that name means to me. It's a play on words in a few different ways. Now, obviously, a network can be like a personal and professional network. And to some extent, the Marian Flaxman Network just represents people that I know and have met and have come across in my journey. It's people that I've networked with. That's who I reach out to. That's who I speak with. Those are the stories that I like to elevate because I think in my own personal and professional journey, I've met people who, whether or not they appreciate it, have really, really interesting stories. And it's a joy and a privilege to be able to help them share those stories. So often people show up to their work, to their professional lives, and you only see a snippet of them. And of course, we can't bring our whole selves to everything that we do every day. But in this space, through this podcast, I am committed to bringing these personal narratives back into critical public health topics because I have been so fortunate to meet so many interesting people who have meaningful personal stories that inform the work that they do within the space that I broadly define as public health. The other thing that the Marian Flaxman Network means to me is it's referring to the way that I think about things. I'm a very associative thinker. My brain is always connecting dots. And so I'm always networking information and seeing how topics connect that aren't always connected in the common narrative about those topics. So, for example, I wrote a paper during graduate school about the role of the soil microbiome as it pertains to human nutrition security. Those topics are intimately linked, and I'm going to go a bit more into that later in this episode. But the average soil scientist isn't necessarily thinking about food policy, and the average food policy professional isn't necessarily thinking about soil science. So for me, I am always looking at every topic that I learn about and thinking broadly, how does that network into other things that I know about? And how can I connect the dots between those two topics and answer some interesting questions along the way? So, in addition to highlighting my personal and professional network through this podcast and sharing personal stories, I also hope to connect dots and to integrate topics into each other that the average person might not necessarily think to connect or might not know how they connect. So, that was my goal last season, and that's my goal moving forward into this season. Looking back again at season 1, I want to talk a little bit about some of my favorite episodes and some of the crowd favorites as well. The number one top listened episode of the entire podcast was my nutritional neuroscience conversation with Dr. Katie Holton. Honestly, I can't say I'm surprised because I am also obsessed with Dr. Holton, but her episode was far and away the most popular and was shared so many times. I think that that conversation, when someone first hears it, it's the kind of conversation that you realize you have to share with someone you know because it opens up this entirely new topic that the average person is not thinking about on a daily basis. And that topic, of course, is how nutrition is impacting neurotransmission or how the brain works. And because the brain governs the functioning of our entire body and certainly is impacting our emotions and our cognition and how we think and interact, it's very critical that more people come to understand the complex, nuanced role that nutrition is playing in how their brain functions on a daily basis. Dr. Holton's work is pivotal in that space, and she's currently doing an incredible amount of research validating the role of a certain type of diet for certain types of neurological conditions. But even outside of that specific field, and dietary free glutamate is what her diet focuses on avoiding, and she has certain populations that her work is focused on. But there are many applications for the understanding of the role that nutrition plays in neurotransmission, including things like understanding how certain nutrient deficiencies or certain types of dietary patterns can contribute to common forms of neurological and psychiatric illness. I've seen some papers recently coming out linking certain types of dietary patterns to diseases such as schizophrenia. There are many papers covering the connection between the human gut microbiome and a wide variety of neurological and psychiatric conditions. And of course, the gut microbiome is constantly interacting with our diet. So nutritional neuroscience was a very hot topic last season, and I hope to discuss that even more in the coming season. Perhaps we'll get Dr. Holton back on here, and certainly some of her colleagues to speak more about the topic. Another popular episode last season was with Dr. Sona Vasudevan, and she runs the systems medicine major at Georgetown University School of Medicine. I mean, Dr. Vasudevan, again, is a hero of mine and a mentor, so I'm not surprised that her episode was popular and that people wanted to share it and spread the word. But I also think that across both these episodes, we see an interest in people learning more about the need for precision approaches. This idea that there's no one size fits all approach. And something that Dr. Vasudeva and I discussed was that people often think that public health and precision approaches are at odds with each other, and I don't think so. I think that we need to better understand the precision approaches to inform public health approaches, and that we also can make certain changes at a population level that can benefit everyone while still always working to do that nuanced work at the individual level. I recently started a job at the Cornell University Center for Precision Nutrition and Health. And I know that one of the reasons I was drawn to the center and to its director was because we share that value, this idea that it's important to do precision nutrition research, but that we have to be able to bring that knowledge to the population level at certain points, and that it's never one or the other, and it's always both. So, again, looking ahead to this season, I hope that we can kind of piggyback off of the interest that people have shown in these precision and systems driven approaches, these sort of tailored, nuanced, how can someone change their diet to optimize neurotransmission? How can someone better understand their health through a systems lens? I hope that we can kind of take that as a starting point and run with it. But looking ahead to this season, my intention is to focus even more fully on food. So, food is a really, really big topic. And ultimately, for me, my journey into this space, into this work, whether it's health and nutrition, food policy, whether it's precision nutrition research, it all starts with me being a kid, a teenager, who had this realization that what you eat has the potential to change not only how you feel, but how you live day to day, and to change everything about your life. So realizing the potentially gigantic, impactful role that food can play in the lives of individuals, we also have to understand and focus on, similarly, the impactful, gigantic role that food plays at a societal level, right? So every single individual can change their life by making different dietary choices. But as we shift those individual choices, it shifts societal patterns and trends. And on the flip side, if we make some societal changes, for example, recently some legislation has been passed banning certain food dyes and food additives, specifically in California, but there is some legislation on the table in other states and potentially nationally eventually as well. As we make these population wide changes, those will have a trickle down impact on each individual's health as well. So, a population is made up of individuals. As individuals change their food habits, that changes population health. But as we change population regulations, policies, and roles, that also can shift individual health. And it all comes back to food. Food can be medicine, it can be poison, it has the potential to drive disease or to drive healing and wellness. And because of my work and because of what I care about, I want to put the lens even more fully on food this season. We talked a lot about food last season, but I want to do that even more so this season. Last season, we had an episode called What Do Farmers Worry About? And on that episode, I really kind of put the whole Marian Flaxman Network toolbox to use. So it was, on the one hand, a representative interview sample of people in my network sharing their personal stories. And it was also me attempting to network together a few different complex topics: the Farm Bill, food policy, nutrition policy, health policy, tax subsidies, agricultural policy, and then the real life people who are impacted by all of that. Of course, every single one of us in America is impacted by food and agricultural policy. So, when I look back on that episode, what I hope people took away from it is, first of all, there are incredible people out there doing the work every single day to make sure that we have food. Many of them are sounding the alarm that the way that we've been producing and transporting food for the last 75 years is not really optimal and is leading us down a path of destruction. And then it's time to kind of shift things a bit, right the ship, and fix the economics and agricultural science around the way that we produce, store, process, and ship food. But I also hope that people took away from that episode just that everything is connected. It's all connected. None of these topics exist in a vacuum. You can't talk about the Farm Bill without talking about Medicare and Medicaid and health policy and health spending in America, right? The way that we incentivize and subsidize certain foods drives health trends, drives healthcare spending, drives economic outcomes, drives national debt. The topics are all connected, and we cannot avoid that. Another topic that I didn't even really get to address on my farm episode last season was the role that food and farming plays in environmental concerns and conversations around climate change. Food touches climate change, and climate change touches food, and they feed back on each other in critical ways that need to be addressed together, not in isolation. When we talk about the way that we raise animals for food, when we talk about the way that food is transported, where does our food come from? What are the chemicals that we're spraying on crops in order to produce food? How are we mining certain compounds and trucking them as to be used as inputs in farms? How is that causing environmental destruction? The way that we feed cows changes the way that they produce gas, and the way that we process foods and have factories that are chugging through fossil fuels to power themselves to produce those foods. And how far is food traveling to make it to our table? And what is the true cost of food? We see the cost at the grocery store or the costs when we're doing our institutional ordering for school food, hospital food, prison food, but are we taking into account all of the costs along the way throughout the supply chain and accounting for environmental destruction and environmental contamination and the role that the food system is playing in climate change and other environmental concerns? So, again, this is a complex topic where there are people that are passionate about climate change, there are people that are passionate about food and nutrition policy. It's often not the same people, and that's okay because there's lots of work to do. But I do believe, my own personal belief is that it's so important to find the people who are willing to talk about the intersections of those topics and to think through how to address them together moving forward. If we try to just solve climate change by, shooting compounds up into the atmosphere or like putting a big mirror up there to reflect light or whatever it is that the next tech bro wants to suggest, and we don't think about getting cows back onto pasture, I really don't think that we're going to solve it. It's going to be just chasing the problem, playing whack-a-mole with these issues. Ultimately, the issues overlap. And again, ultimately, it all comes back to food. Food is something that we all share. I think I've shared on the podcast before, or certainly if you've met, we've talked about it. But when I was in high school, I had some disordered eating habits. I had been overweight and obese, and then I became underweight, and I struggled with figuring out where the middle ground was, right? Because it was easy for me to overeat, and it was easy for me to undereat or to not eat at all. But finding that healthy, balanced place in the middle was really confusing for a while, especially looking back on it because the foods that I was consuming were mostly ultra processed and they made me feel really unwell. But I thought to myself, well, I'm eating foods that are supposedly healthy, but I feel really sick. So it just felt like it might be easier not to have to eat at all. And I remember at one point crying and saying to a friend, if I were an alcoholic or something, it would be so easy because I could just not drink. But when it comes to food, you can't just quit. If you have issues with food, if you have an issue with any other drug, it's simple. It's like, well, it's not simple, but it's more black and white. It's like, hey, don't do that drug. Got it. That's a very difficult thing for many people to overcome, but at least the binary exists where you know that you should not consume that substance ultimately to move towards healing. When it comes to food and food issues, food addictions, food dependency, it is not that simple. The path towards healing with food is not abstinence, it's nuance, it's rebuilding that relationship. Ultimately, I think that that's wonderful because it forced me and it forces everyone to really look in the mirror and look at what we're eating and approach it with this gray area. There's no yes, no, there's no black, white answer. That's true of most complex topics. And so it's important to have that approach and that training. But as a teenager, it was very confusing and complicated. And I thought, God, wouldn't it just be so much easier if I could just not eat? But we do have to eat. pretty much every single day. You can take a few days off, but most of the time, most people need to eat every day. So, food is a thing that we're all consuming every day, we're all interacting with every day, and we all have an emotional, physical, cultural relationship with food. Whether or not you're a chef, whether or not you work in food and nutrition policy, whether or not you've studied nutrition, you know something about food. You know what you like, you know what you don't like. You might know what makes you feel good and what makes you not feel so good. You know what your kids like and what they don't like. And you know what your grandma made, and you know what your mom made, and you know what you have at Christmas every year or what you have at Halloween. Everyone has these cultural touch points and traditions that touch and intersect with food. And so, food is just this huge topic that touches every other topic that involves human health and public health and One Health. So, on this season, I'm just going to focus on that a bit more clearly because I think it's been obvious from day one that food is important to me and the role of food in all these complex topics is important to me. But I really want to drive it home even more clearly. I want to talk about food policy. I want to talk about food as medicine. I want to talk about food waste and how we grow and produce food and all of the people involved in it. This season, we're going to speak with chefs, with dietitians, with food policy makers, with health and nutrition educators and researchers. We're going to talk with everyone from nutritionists to doctors to chefs to school food personnel, everyone that touches food in our culture that's trying to make a difference and to improve the health of humanity through the lens of food, and that's both physical, emotional, and mental health. Those stories will be highlighted this season. Okay, now I want to just talk a little bit about three conferences that I was a part of in the past 6 months, again, that all touch on food, health, and nutrition that were very, very impactful. And also, you'll see across this season some voices highlighted from people that I met at those conferences. So, the first one is a conference that I actually co chaired and hosted at Georgetown University School of Medicine. It was the first ever Food as Medicine with a focus on the microbiome conference. And we had speakers who ranged from microbiome researchers from Harvard, like Dr. Alessio Fasano, all the way to chefs and professional food fermentation experts who flew in from Japan. It was a very cool conference, and having all those different voices in the same room was especially nourishing to me because I really saw how they could overlap and speak with each other. I don't think that we often think about putting chefs and fermentation experts in the same room as MD, PhDs who are researching the gut microbiome of infants in India. But there they were in the same room, and they were having really interesting conversations. And for me, someone who's kind of straddled both of those spaces, it was very exciting to see how that conversation could grow and become something even bigger as the years go on. So I was very excited to co chair that. And I very much am looking forward to doing more work in that space and connecting and bringing some of those voices to the table and to this season of the podcast. The second conference was the American College of Culinary Medicine conference, which they refer to their curriculum as Health Meets Food. And that was a conference that was very exciting because their focus is much more on the culinary presentation of food as medicine. So, in the food as medicine space, there's lots of talk about policy and prescriptions and how doctors can make food recommendations. But culinary medicine spends more time actually talking about the production side of it and the skills involved in making food. So, for example, one of the days we had a challenge to open up our basket, like on the TV show Chopped, and produce a healthy, nourishing meal from the ingredients in our basket, which were restricted by certain limitations. My basket was supposed to represent food that you would get from a food bank. There was a can of tuna, there was some tomato paste, there was some whole wheat spaghetti, a few other ingredients, right? And then just using basic pantry staples, we had to produce a healthy, tasty, compelling meal. I think that's so important because even in the food as medicine space, in the policy landscape, and in the rooms where everyone there is passionate about nutrition and using food as medicine, we don't often address enough the role that cooking plays in all of this. I mean, I spend hours a week, hours a day sometimes cooking for my family. Does the average person have time to do that? Do they have the skills to do that? Do they have the inclination to do that? And if not, does that mean that using food to heal is not for them? Or do we need to get more creative and interested in how we can facilitate this change for the average person, even when they don't have a culinary background or a decade working as a chef or personal chef or running restaurants? Even people that don't have culinary expertise need to be able to utilize food as medicine. Where are the solutions that help us move that forward? So, I love the American College of Culinary Medicine for focusing on the role that food producers play in the food as medicine space, and also for actually training doctors how to cook and encouraging doctors to show up really honestly and authentically with their patients and say, hey, cooking can be time consuming and difficult. Let's get you a knife skills class. Let's get you a class with a health coach and registered dietitian to teach you some easy 15-minute meals for weeknights, right? We need to actually enable people to produce the healthy food that we recommend that they eat. Otherwise, food as medicine is just going to become produce that gets thrown in the trash. And the average person is not composting still. So it's going to be a lot of greenhouse gases and a lot of food waste. So we have to have these conversations about facilitation, and that was what I really appreciated about the American College of Culinary Medicine. They also had a keynote speaker who spoke about the importance of making food that people actually want to eat. And this is an important thing as well. I have 3 kids, and so I have the toughest food critics because, while an adult might choke down a bland salad, a kid is gonna give it to you straight. So I've spent all of my career cooking for very picky eaters in a variety of contexts. The pickiness changes with the kid and with their season and with the age of life, but I do think that this is an important thing to address. We're not going to flip the script overnight. When someone's palate is adjusted to hyper palatable, ultra processed foods, we need to transition them and meet them in the middle. If you have someone who's eating takeout and pizza 5 nights a week, and you tell them suddenly that all they can have is like a low salt bowl of quinoa with some steamed vegetables on it and like raw salads, first of all, they may experience some digestive distress as they adjust to consuming all that fiber, but they also might just lose their joy of eating entirely. So, this is one of those nuance, wade into the complexity areas where we have to figure out how to meet people where they are, meet them in the middle, and create transition approaches that help people embrace the joys of healthy eating without getting turned off by how things seem or taste to them when they first try it. I think someone else at that conference said something like, I tell people like this is delicious, you just have to get used to eating it. And I hear and I understand that message for sure. Like not everyone's going to love kimchi the first time they try it. There are some flavors that you become adjusted to and then begin to crave. But I think that more than just lecturing to people and saying this does taste good once you get used to it, we have to actually walk them there and help them learn to cook food that tastes good to them. I believe very deeply that healthy eating is not a sacrifice, it is a privilege beyond measure. Every bite I take is nourishing and delicious, and I know how privileged I am to have that experience. It's a privilege to know how to cook. It's a privilege to have access to fresh, local, seasonal produce. It's a privilege to know farmers who will deliver grass fed meat to my door and to be able to afford it. All of these things are luxury, not restraint and constraint and rules. It's not rules, it's not diet, it's not restriction, it's not limits. It is luxury and pleasure and joy. But most people don't necessarily think that way about healthy eating. And there's been a lot of effective marketing about healthy eating being bland and cardboard and boring, and it's all steamed tofu and broccoli. And that's just not the case, right? So, Yes, we do have to be a little bit honest with people who have been eating ultra processed foods for their whole life, that as they adjust to eating real simple foods, it may take some time for their palate to really understand the nuance of those flavors. But I think we can also meet them in the middle and say, let's make a delicious sweet potato muffin together. We don't have to use that boxed mix that has food coloring and artificial flavors. We can do it with cardamom and nutmeg and cinnamon and organic cane sugar or coconut sugar and some molasses. And we can make something delicious and flavorful and still very palatable that just has more nutrients. There is a middle ground. So, shout out to the American College of Culinary Medicine for kind of moving that conversation forward, actually cooking and producing healthy food, not just talking about it, not just advocating for it, but really equipping physicians and researchers and policymakers and also food service professionals with the tools and the skills to both advocate for and produce healthy, nourishing food. The third conference that I went to, which was just incredible, and I've said this to everyone who will listen, but it just felt like a conference that was designed just for me. Like, hey, Marian, if you could think of every single topic you've ever wanted to discuss in one room, what would that conference be about? It was the Rodale Institute's Regenerative Healthcare Conference. This conference literally talked about the role that food as medicine plays, but with a focus starting on how the food is grown, rooted in the soil microbiome. So, connecting soil microbiomes to human gut microbiomes, connecting diet to climate change, connecting doctors to farmers, and speaking about farmers as frontline healthcare workers. I just loved every single minute of this conference, and every single person that I met there felt like they were magically picked from the universe to end up in that room because we all came from such different backgrounds. There was an Amish farmer who was there from Maine. There were doctors there, gynecologists. There were nutritionists, dietitians. There were doctors who focus on population health and public health. There were doctors who focus on cancer prevention and treatment. There were some plant-based practitioners who specialize in that. There was a cattle rancher who specializes in regenerative agriculture. Everyone there was so different, and yet we all had this thing in common, which was caring so deeply about the role that food plays in health and the role that agriculture plays in food and the role that food, agriculture, and people play in society and the future of our planet. So I really, really just can't say enough about how impactful and incredible the Rodale Institute's work is. And they just curated this 4-day stretch of nonstop education and entertainment and collaboration and networking that truly felt unique. And I definitely would recommend that anyone check out that work because it was incredibly impactful for me, but I know that it's also just impactful for the future of food and how we address our needs for food in our society in the near term. Because if you've heard the warnings from some professionals, they say things like, we only have 40 harvests left. And um, that's a scary number, folks. When you think about the way that we depend on harvests of food to feed ourselves and to just keep our society running, staring down the barrel of if we keep doing things the way that we're doing them, we won't be able to grow food on this planet for that much longer. I don't want to see what that looks like. I don't want to wait to see what it looks like in 40 years. I think that we should be making the change now. So, the people at Rodale and a lot of activists and scientists and educators and farmers and doctors are working together to sound the alarm and make those changes now. As a related side note, I would strongly recommend watching the documentary Kiss the Ground and the follow-up documentary Common Ground and looking into the work of the organization Kiss the Ground because they're very focused on how healing the earth and specifically the ground and the soil will play a huge role in human health, environmental, and planetary health. Because again, it's all connected. Food and the soil, policy and the environment, all of these big, complicated topics that feel overwhelming, they touch each other in ways that are so important. And we have to look at those overlaps and look for solutions that address more than one problem at the same time. So, on season 2 of the Marian Flaxman Network podcast, we will be doing just that. We'll be speaking with farmers, with educators, with doctors, with scientists, and we're going to bring it always back to food and the role that food plays in everything that we do. I hope that you're curious and excited to learn more. And I hope that you're beginning to think about the way that how you eat impacts not just your own personal health and maybe the health of your children or family members, but also the role that your dietary and nutrition choices and purchasing play in your community. Are you going to the farmer's market? Are you supporting a local system of agriculture? Are you buying things that are grown sustainably, regeneratively, organically? If you care about climate change, are you thinking about how your grocery purchasing may or may not be benefiting or harming the planet? And are you connecting those dots? I know that it can be so overwhelming, which is why I hope that I can take the stories and the experiences of people that I've met along the way and elevate them to give people not just hope for the future and some knowledge that there are incredible people already doing this work and fighting for the planet and for our food system and for our health on everyone's behalf, but also to share some tools that each of us who works in this space and cares about it use on a daily basis to ensure that our connection to food is as healthy as it can be and as sustainable as it can be. Because I think that when you look at the world and all the complex topics and issues, there are ones that I don't spend all day thinking about because we can't, each one of us, spend all day thinking about every single tragedy that's occurring on the planet at the same time. It's too much. We would collapse or implode. But each of us can figure out the areas of it that are the most important to us, and we can fight like hell to make it better. And I think that as we fight like hell, we learn things, we learn tools and tricks, we learn little pieces of hope and optimism. And I really believe that it's important to share those tools and tricks and hope and optimism, because if we don't, then it just feels like doomsday every day. And our nervous system can't handle that. And the future of our planet cannot handle that. It's all connected and we're all in this together. So, looking ahead to season 2, I hope that you are buckled up and ready to learn a lot about food, how it's produced, how it's served, the role that it plays in health, the role that policy plays in curating the food that ends up on your table, how doctors are learning to rethink food and diet recommendations to their patients, how policy can support meaningful changes in the future of human and planetary health, and how all of these topics connect. I think that even when I'm speaking with doctors, I'm going to get their stories on how they personally eat and the role that food has played in their lives. And certainly when I'm speaking with farmers, I'm going to get their thoughts on the critical role that they play in our food system. So I am very much looking forward to the next episode. Episode 2 of season 2 is coming out next week, and it's going to feature a conversation with a registered dietitian who also has a master's in public health and a certificate in health communication. She currently works very deeply in the food as medicine policy space. That's where she and I met. And she is a passionate, mission-focused mom who is on a mission to improve the health and well-being of our entire country through policy, through education, and she juggles it all with 4 kids at home. So I'm very, very excited to bring that conversation to kick off the new season. And after that, we're just going to keep the ball rolling with educators, chefs, farmers, doctors, policymakers. If they touch food, we're going to talk to them. So thank you so much once again for listening to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast. I hope that you will stick with us through season 2 and get ready to learn all about food and public health. And we'll see you next time.